All right, welcome everyone. I'm Ryan Hoger with Temperature Equipment Corporation. Today's topic is CO2-based demand-controlled ventilation. We are doing this particular webinar in conjunction with Nicor Gas's Energy Smart program, which, as most of you know, is a utility energy savings program here in northeastern Illinois. We actually have done this topic once before for them, and it had such a good turnout, we've been asked to do it again, which is totally awesome. A few different things on that particular Nicor program. As many of you are probably aware, there are different ways to participate in that program. If you are a Nicor Gas customer, commercially speaking, one of the things you can do is an assessment, which is where representatives of the utility come into your building and assess the different things you have going on, kitchen appliances, air handlers, rooftop units, furnaces, boilers, etc. And there's various levels of assessments depending on the size of your facility. And then they'll give you a report letting you know what the top saving things could be to reduce your energy. The other part of the program that you're probably most familiar with is the rebate portion of the program, which is where if you make a certain improvement to your building, the utility will help pay for a portion of that improvement to make the improvement a cost-effective solution for you and hence save energy for you and them for years to come. Some of those typical rebates that you're used to are hydronic rebates, which would include upgrading your boiler to a more efficient boiler system, tuning up your existing boiler, domestic water heating plants at your building, insulating pipe, both domestic and hot water and steam, fixing and repairing steam traps, which is a huge one. On the air side, upgrading your furnaces, installing infrared heaters, which, by the way, there's an infrared heater Nicor training session going on later this week. If you need information about that, send me an email and I will get you a link to register for that. And other air side heating type things. There are controls improvements you can make, programmable thermostats, demand control ventilation like we're talking about today, outside air reset on your boiler, and then commercial food service, and then custom incentives. Custom basically means anything not listed above. If it saves gas, natural gas, it's very probable you can work with the utility to get a custom rebate for that. Is anyone else having issue with sound? Tom notes that there's a cutting in and out. If it's just Tom, then maybe Tom can log out and back in. If it's everybody, then I don't know. Then I'll log out and log back in. Maybe I'll just log out and I won't log back in. I'm just kidding. I won't do that to you. One of the other exciting things going on with the Nicor Gas Rebate Program right now is there are fall bonuses involved. These are extra rebate amounts on top of the regular rebate amounts, and some of these are ridiculously awesome. For example, condensing boilers is a $3,000 bonus. The normal condensing boiler rebates average between, $500 and $3,000. But if you take a $500 boiler rebate and all of a sudden make it $3,500, that's extremely attractive to someone. So get online and take a look at that stuff. It's NicorGasRebates.com. So some of those bonuses are very, very attractive. Obviously, demand control ventilation is also rebatable, if rebatable is a word. It's $150 per sensor, and that's what we're going to be talking about today quite extensively. And we'll talk about rebates related to that. And then if you should need more information about the program, obviously the website is great, NicorGasRebates.com, and you can also contact them, email, phone, etc. And Bill Lewis is one of the outreach folks there that's assigned to work with this area. So if you have questions on that, you're more than welcome to ask me or Bill or anybody affiliated with that program. So on to demand control ventilation. So we're always trying to make buildings comfortable, obviously. That's the whole reason we have HVAC. And temperature is a very obvious indicator of comfort that we're all used to talking about. And many of you also probably are aware there's other factors involved, such as humidity, air motion, radiant, etc. But one of the ones that gets overlooked quite a bit is ventilation. And to kind of understand that, you need to kind of understand where ventilation comes from and what the ventilation codes really are and why we have them. So the way we ventilate buildings today for most projects is the same way we've always ventilated buildings. Ever since we had ventilation codes, we've pretty much done it the same way, which means we tell you a fixed amount of outside air to bring into the building, typically based on the number of people or sometimes based on the number of square footage or sometimes both, but it was some fixed amount based on the maximum design for that space. And that's the way it went, and you opened up your louvers and that was that, or your windows in some cases. Historically, the ventilation rates required by codes have been all over the board. This is a trend graph for office buildings specifically. Other types of buildings would have similar trends. Ignore the giant pyramid on the left-hand side of the graph. If you're working on buildings that were built before World War II and they've never been updated since then, that would be pretty impressive. Chances are they've been remodeled twice since then. But as you can see, it was about 10 CFM per person for many decades. After the energy embargo crisis, it dropped down in the early 80s to about 5 CFM per person. ASHRAE felt that was appropriate in order to save energy. However, it was a little too tight for most people and for most buildings, and we started having the sick building issues in the 1980s. So we kind of overreacted the other way at ASHRAE, went up to 15 CFM per person, then 20, and now for an office building, it's about 17 CFM per person. I say about because it's no longer a per person requirement. The current energy code requirement, the current ventilation code requirement for ASHRAE 62 is a per person plus a per square foot number added together. So for example, for an office building, you're required to bring in 5 CFM per person plus 0.06 CFM per square foot. For an average density office, that comes out to be about 17 CFM per person if we were comparing it to this old chart here, which is why we did it that way. But specifically, the per people and per square foot number has been decoupled. And the primary reason for decoupling those is that we've recognized that there's 2 reasons we ventilate buildings. One is for people, right? So essentially people smell. There's body odors, perfumes, colds, coughs, all that kind of stuff. And we need to dilute those down. And then we also ventilate for the building structure itself because it has issues like VOCs coming off of paint and carpet and furnishings and things like that. So we really got to ventilate for the building structure and materials, and we got to ventilate for the people. The building structure materials don't really change on an hour-by-hour, day-by-day basis. The people can. So by decoupling those 2 things, we're able to modulate the people portion of the code requirement based on how many people showed up to the building today and still get our fixed amount for the other areas. So that's the basic idea. Historically, if you were going into retrofit a building that had the typical 20 CFM per person design from the 1990s and it had 25 people, you would have needed 500 CFM of fresh air. It didn't matter if the place was full or if the place only had 5 people show up or if this lady was there by herself, you still would have been bringing in 500 CFM per person, which is pretty inefficient. Zoning systems, similar but have more dramatic effects. In a zoning system, you have one outside air louver to accommodate 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 dampers, right? Different zones. And those dampers are all throttling, doing their own thing. So normally you're locking down the outside air louver at a minimum, and then you're locking all the zones down at a minimum, and hoping that everything turns out okay. Sometimes you overventilate because of that, right? And sometimes you underventilate certain areas, but on average, you're kind of doing the right thing, right? But on average isn't always good enough. So there are numerous ways to not be just average, and one of those ways is going to be with CO2 sensors. So if we actually control what's going on in these spaces for ventilation, instead of just only controlling this based on temperature, right, if we do it for both, we're going to have a much better shot at getting this thing correct. So instead of just temperature sensors in the space, we're talking about today putting temperature sensors and ventilation sensors, which is going to be CO2 sensors in our case, in these spaces to make sure we're getting both the required temperature and ventilation air that everybody needs. So the whole goal of this idea, this demand control ventilation, is to get the right amount of air to the right place at the right time. It's not a new concept at all. I think I installed my first DCV job. I did, if you don't know, I did direct digital control systems for about 10 years, starting in 1997. But I think I put my first DCV system in 2000. So that's 16 years ago now. It wasn't even really code allowed back then. Well, it wasn't code prohibited, but it wasn't like specifically allowed like it is now, or code required, as you'll see in a minute. So it was a little bit more challenging. Now it's pretty easy to do this. It's widely accepted. So how does it actually work? What are the fundamentals behind this kind of concept and this technology? So as I mentioned, we have ventilation standards, ASHRAE 62.1 being the most well-known of the commercial ventilation standards. We also have the International Mechanical Code, which is fed off of that standard, and the other municipal codes. But then we also have the energy standards and codes, ASHRAE 90.1 and IECC, that are also involved in here. So you got one code and standard saying, hey, you need to bring in this fresh air for people. And you got another one saying, don't spend too much energy heating and cooling that fresh air, right? And it would seem like they're sort of in conflict with each other, and back in the day they sort of were. But for more than a decade now, these standards and codes have been in sync with each other, and they work very complementary to each other. So one of the other things to recognize is that carbon dioxide, CO2, is what we're talking about. It is a measure of the ventilation rate in a space. It has little to nothing to do with indoor air quality. I know we always say it's indoor air quality. I know the little sensor labels on the economizer damper say IAQ on them. I get it. The CO2 level in a space does not tell you if the space has good air quality or bad air quality. I could have very good CO2 levels, but I could be leaking out, poisonous gases out of something, right? Or I could have a can of gasoline sitting on my desk, or I could have paint stored in my closet that's leaking, VOCs into my space, right? And none of that would be picked up by a CO2 sensor. So CO2 is not an indoor air quality sensor. CO2 is a measurement of ventilation rate. You're going to see how that works here in a little bit. I also point out, and I shouldn't have to with all of you guys that are being engineers, but I have to because of the amount of specs I see saying the wrong thing. CO2 and CO are not the same thing. CO is carbon monoxide. It is a deadly poisonous gas, which is a byproduct of incomplete combustion. CO2, as you know, is carbon dioxide. It is something naturally found all over the atmosphere, and you exhale it out of your body when you breathe. Two different things, but that one little tiny 2 at the end throws everybody off. So please take a look at all your specs and do not ask for CO sensors to control the ventilation of your office building or your school or something like that. It happens literally weekly. CO2 levels don't get harmful until you get up to extremely high amounts, like 30,000 parts per million. I don't know how you could even get to that without locking yourself inside a thermos bottle. I have CO2 sensors sitting here on my desk, and breathing on them, I've never been able to, breathing directly on them within an inch, I've never been able to get them over about 5,000, which is really high. So getting up to a harmful level is not realistic, so you shouldn't have to worry about CO2 being a poison or a contaminant or anything like that. The good news about CO2 is all the people exhale it, and we all, well, assuming we're alive, right? We all exhale it at a very predictable rate, and it is very much a function of what you are doing. If you are sitting at your desk, you are exercising your body at a certain level, and you're taking in a certain amount of oxygen, and hence you're exhaling a certain amount of CO2. If you're at the gym and you're running on the treadmill, you're probably working with 3 or 4 times the level of CO2 because you need that much more oxygen because you have that much more metabolic energy that you're working with. So what you're doing makes a big difference. For most of the buildings we're talking about, offices, schools, movie theaters, these types of places, you're probably down here where this gray dot is at. You're at 1 metabolic unit, right? And you are at very minimal CO2 production relative to somebody working out or on a treadmill or something of that nature. The other thing about CO2 is that people are mostly producing it at the same rate. So if I have 1 person in the room and I put 2 in the room, I'll probably have double the CO2. 3, I would have triple. 4, I'd have quadruple. So really, if I'm measuring CO2, I'm really counting people. And if I'm counting people, I know how much the code required ventilation air is going to be for them. That's where these things kind of tie in together. Now, I'm not directly counting the people. I'm measuring the CO2 level, and people aren't the only factor, right? Theoretically, I could have plants and stuff like that in there that are absorbing CO2, but unless you're in a greenery, I don't think that's an issue. The real issue is you have ventilation air coming in, diluting that CO2 down, bringing in fresh air from outside. So if I have a bunch of people that pile into a room, how long does it take for my CO2 sensor to really make a difference? Well, it honestly depends on what your ventilation rate is, right? So if I look at these curves on this chart here, if I'm ventilating at about 15 CFM per person, which is fairly close to the code, so the yellow line, it's going to take me 35, 40 minutes before I get to a level, stable amount, right? If I'm ventilating at a much higher rate, it'll happen sooner. If I'm ventilating at a very low rate, like 5 CFM total, this is per person plus square foot merged together, I should have mentioned that, it may take me 2-3 hours to level off. Now that doesn't mean it takes 2-3 hours for the sensor to do something. That's just how long it takes to level the space out. As soon as the CO2 sensor notices a difference, it's going to start modulating your damper more open or more closed to bring in more or less fresh air. So it may take 5-10 minutes for something to happen. If a bunch of us go into a conference room and start breathing, CO2 is approximately the same weight as air, so it's going to move up and down, left and right. It's going to want to expand across the entire volume of the room equally. So I'm going to get the sensor on the wall picking it up fairly quickly. And we'll talk about sensor locations and things like that in a little bit. So the idea would be that if I have this same little bank project with 25 people and I was required to bring in 500 CFM per code, I would normally do that on most jobs. But if I put CO2 sensors on the wall and I measured how many people were actually breathing in there, and I realized there was only 5 in there, well, then I would only bring 100 CFM in instead of 500, which means I don't have to heat, cool, humidify, dehumidify, and filter that other 400, which obviously you can start equating to some energy savings in your head. And if this lady was by herself there at night counting the money all alone, which is probably not a great idea, but if she was, I'd only need 20 CFM per person. Now, I'm probably never going to drop it down to actually just 20. For one, it's a really microscopic number to measure with a damper louver. But on the other side of it, I'm probably going to have a bath fan or something like that running that I have to make up air for. And I also want to keep most commercial buildings of this type slightly positive. So I might not go down that low. And we'll talk about how low we can really go down in real life here in a minute. So we're going to ventilate it to the actual occupancy, not to the design occupancy. So, if I had my VAV zone damper system again, instead of some of these guys being over-ventilated and some under-ventilated, I should be able to get them all ideally ventilated, which means ventilating for the exact amount of people in that room. There's a few things that will happen with that, and I know a lot of you that do VAV are probably thinking, oh my gosh, if I open up that damper more and I bring in more cold air, I'm going to overcool that space. And that's one way to think of it, but it's actually going to be really the opposite scenario. I am never at any point in time going to be bringing in more air than I would have otherwise brought in on a non-DCV job. So don't think of it as the CO2 sensor makes more air come into the room. It's going to start out with the code required amount, and if you don't show up in that room or in that building or whatever we're talking about, we're going to modulate it down lower than that. So you're never going to need more reheat than you would have needed on a regular project or anything like that. You're always going to be bringing in the same as the code required or less outside air than the code required. And that's true not just for the zoning job, but constant volume single zone jobs as well. Same kind of idea. I'm not modulating the damper open more, right? I'm modulating it less when you don't show up. And by you, I mean whoever the building occupants are. If I want to do this on zoning system, it's a little bit harder than if I want to do it on a regular system. So packaged rooftops and even packaged split systems, constant volume, this is super easy. Every single economizer controller from every single manufacturer I've ever seen, and by the way, almost all of them come from Honeywell, for the past 10, 12, 15 years, they all have an input on them waiting for a CO2 sensor. The economizer controller has it. You got to wire the sensor in, and then on the economizer controller, you have to set the set point you want. But other than that, the economizer controllers are waiting for this. It's super easy. It's super inexpensive. If you want to do it on a zoning system, it becomes more complicated. You would have to have a DDC system. You cannot do this with pneumatics or analog zone damper controls. So essentially, you're going to wire a CO2 sensor to each DDC VAV box actuator, and that particular VAV box can open and close his damper to bring more or less duct air in, whatever I have in the duct, right? And that'll help dilute the space down for the CO2 level. If I have a space that's trending higher and I'm keep opening his damper more and more and it's not getting it done, then I need to tell the main air handler damper, the outside air louver, to open up more. So essentially from a DDC control standpoint, each zone damper is just reacting locally. And then from the outside air damper standpoint, I'm just reading all of those zone dampers and just looking at whoever the highest is. Who has the highest CO2 level? Great. I'm going to pull him in and I'm going to use that as my only single CO2 level. And if I make him happy, obviously everybody else that has less needs is going to be happy too. That's kind of how that would work on a zoning system, which zoning is a whole other animal. So let's launch our first poll question. And while I'm doing that, if you have questions that you want to enter for me to answer, this is a great time to do that as well. So our first poll question, select the most true statement about CO2. So A, CO2 is deadly gas. B, CO2 is an indicator of building occupancy and ventilation. C, CO2 level of 1,000 parts per million is unsafe. And D, CO2 sensors can be used to indicate IAQ. All right, you should see that poll question up on your screen. And once again, if you need PDH credit, it is important to answer these questions correctly. If you don't need credit, you can answer them for fun. And if you just want to mess with me, you can pick the most stupid answer and watch me get frustrated. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. Looks like 2 other people in addition to Tom had said there was some sound issues, but then everybody else after that seemed to say the sound cleared up magically on its own. So hopefully that's the case for most folks. All right, 85% of you have answered the question. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So 94% of you got it correct. The answer is B. CO2 is an indicator of building occupancy and ventilation. All right, we are going to resume on with our topic. All right, I'm not going to go through all these studies. I've got a bunch of them on here, and I got details on each one of these studies. So if anybody's really into this kind of stuff, I can send it to you. Some of these studies are just indicating, overall indoor air quality being linked to ventilating correctly, and CO2 is one way to help ventilate correctly. So that's how that IAQ word kind of got associated with the CO2 in that regard. This is one of the studies particularly interesting because it correlates high CO2 levels to poor performance in schools, which usually means grades when they talk about school studies. So it's not because the CO2 level is high necessarily. It's more likely because the high CO2 level means you have poor ventilation rates, and the poor ventilation rate is actually what's causing you an issue with your students. Some of these studies are based on office buildings, and generally in those cases it's based on throughput, but the school ones are usually based on grades and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of these on here. I'm not going to go through them all. I like this one in particular, not because it's a great one for CO2, but I like the fact that they say for every dollar spent on ventilation, you're going to save $2 in sick time, which sounds like it could be like a really important thing for your business until you realize all your employees are still going to use their sick days. They're just going to use them when they want to go on extra vacation. They're not going to use them when they're sick. But hey, at least it's better than everybody being at the office hacking all over the place. That's kind of the deal with that. There are some school studies specifically related to air quality, and there's a lot of schools, lots and lots of schools that have very poor air quality that are rated below standard. This is a 10-year-old study, but the data is not much better when you hear about newer ones. And in most cases, these studies can be linked back to if you increase your outdoor air ventilation rates, you can improve your air quality. Decreasing them generally hurts it. Now, you're wondering why I would say that in general, right? Why would I want to decrease the air quality if that's going to hurt my student performance? The low ventilation rates are an issue when they're below the code required amount. If I have the CO2 sensor on there, not only is it going to ensure that I bring in the code required amount, which a lot of buildings don't do, but on the buildings where I'm bringing in too much because not everybody's there, it's going to help me throttle that back. So there's kind of a double benefit here. I can basically guarantee I'm going to get the right ventilation rate, and I'm not going to underventilate or overventilate. Either one of those will have its own associated problems. It used to be that these were hard to do, these projects with DCV, because the codes did not specifically spell out if you could do them or how you could do them. They didn't say you couldn't, they just didn't say you could, right, or how to do it. As you know, ASHRAE 62.1 is the standard I referenced previously. That feeds into the International Mechanical Code. And for the things we're talking about today, ventilation rates and demand control ventilation, basically all the language is the same. So for our purposes today, these two things are the same. And then typically your local codes will adopt the International Mechanical Code or some version of that, unless you live in Wisconsin or in Chicago, and we'll talk about you separately in a minute. So here's what the mechanical code language would be, what it would say. This is out of 62.1 2013, but the IMC is very similar. It says you're allowed to reset the outdoor intake airflow, right, based on the needs of the space. And then it specifically calls out CO2-based demand control ventilation as being one of the mechanisms to be able to ventilate less when people are not there, right? So this was a key thing. This happened in the 2004 version and has been there since. And once 2004 version came out, or at least addendum N to the 2004 version, it became much easier for us to go ahead and do these types of projects without having any code issues with the code guy saying, oh, you can't do that. That's weird, right? This made it explicitly clear on that we could do it and how to do it. International Mechanical Code followed suit when its next publication came out in 2006, right? So that language is the same. If you are in Wisconsin or in Chicago, your situation is different because you're the two places in the country that have your own special ventilation situation. Wisconsin has a fixed ventilation rate of 7.5 CFM per person. They don't follow the ASHRAE or IMC recommendations directly. There's no square footage number, right? There's just 7.5 CFM per person, regardless of any building type or anything like that. So in Wisconsin, a DCV project becomes a little bit more custom. I'm not saying you can't do it, but you have to illustrate to the mechanical department for the state on what your base rate is going to be and what it's going to be based on. If you need help with that and you're in Wisconsin, let me know, or let Focus on Energy know. We had worked with them a couple years ago at the state level to identify what they wanted to see on a project, and I think both I and Focus on Energy have a good concept of what they want, so we can help you with that if you're doing a project in Wisconsin. If you're doing a project in the city of Chicago, demand control ventilation was actually explicitly allowed in the code before anything was even mentioned in ASHRAE or IMC. So Chicago was way ahead of the curve in this regard. However, the Chicago code language has not really changed in the past 13 years either. So you can do DCV in the city of Chicago. The only thing weird about Chicago is you have to use a CO2 set point of 1,000 parts per million. Whereas if you're following ASHRAE standards and say you got an office building or something like that, what you normally do is a set point of 700 parts per million above the outdoor air level. And around this area of the country, outdoor air levels are about 450 to 500. So let's say 450. 450 plus 700 would be 1,150 parts per million as your CO2 set point. So the Chicago number is a little more conservative. Their 1,000 evolved from some traditional numbers from literally like 70, 80 years ago because there was nothing better for them to reference. But now ASHRAE and IMC have better numbers. So the next Chicago code ventilation cycle update, maybe we'll get that tweaked. But the point is you can do it, and you just got to do it slightly different with your control sequence. But it's not hard to do at all. In addition to the mechanical codes finally allowing you to do DCV for the past 10 years or so, 12 years or so, the energy codes have actually kicked in and started requiring you to do DCV in many applications. So that's ASHRAE standard 90.1, as you know. International Energy Conservation Code piggybacks off that. As far as DCV goes, these two are in sync and they have essentially the same language. And in many cases, your local code adopts one or both of these. In the state of Illinois, we follow the IECC 2015. All the neighboring states follow another version of it as well. The 2012 and 2015 IECC has the same language, which means for spaces that have a population density of 25 people per 1,000 square foot or more, you're required to do demand control ventilation. For states on the 2009 code, it's the same essential language written here on the screen, except it's 40 people per 1,000 square foot instead of 25. So 2009, 2012, and 2015 all require demand control ventilation for high density areas. The density rate is just a little bit different for those. But if you look at it, I mean, that's, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40 different states that require demand control ventilation in some fashion, right? Now, there's a few exceptions to it when you don't have to do it. For example, process loads have an exception to it. Very small systems with not very much outside air have an exception to it. If you have pneumatic zoning, then you don't have to do it. If you have DDC, you do. If you have ERVs, you don't have to do it because ERVs are saving outdoor air energy and CO2 sensors are saving outdoor air energy, and they don't add together. They fight in for each other's savings, so it doesn't really make cost-effective sense to do both. But other than those kind of examples, you're very probably going to have to do it for high-density spaces, which are going to typically mean, just to make rules of thumb here, movie theaters, indoor sporting venues, some larger conference rooms, places like that, high school auditoriums, some high school classrooms. You may have to do this kind of thing. All right, so keep that in mind. These are states as of July that were on those various codes. So anything in blue, green, or yellow has some type of demand control ventilation required by energy code. If you're in white, then you are in the total wild, wild west, and you can do whatever you want because you don't have energy codes in your state. You can't do whatever you want, but you get the point. All right, so quiz question number 2, and then I'm going to go read some of your guys' questions. So number 2, true or false? Mechanical codes allow DCV systems to reduce the outside air ventilation below the otherwise code-required minimum. True or false? While you look at that, I'm going to try to read these questions basically in the order they came. Bruce wrote, it was 5 CFM per person and the area multiplier was what? I'm not sure on the exact question, Bruce, or which slide we're even talking about. I'm going to try to go back a little bit, but to see if I can figure out what you were, when you asked that. Yeah, I'm not sure which one. You have to call me on it separately, Bruce. I'm not sure on your question. Mike asks if we're going to discuss CO2 sensor calibration. Yes, we definitely are going to discuss that today. He said he often finds CO2 sensors lose calibration within a year. We'll talk about that. He often finds some of them have errors early on in the installation process, often related to faulty sensors or bad setup. So we are going to address some of that, Mike, yes. Phil says he's working on a project in a retail store. Ventilation rate is 0.12 CFM per square foot plus the per person weight. The square foot volume dwarfs the per person as occupancy is low. Any DCV opportunity there? Yes, absolutely, there's an opportunity there. Just because a percentage-wise it's not a big amount like it might be in a high person requirement, the person requirement is still pretty substantial though. So don't look at the percentage world, look at the actual CFM. Because honestly, a CO2 sensor, already going to an economizer that has an input, your real cost is the sensor and the wire, and that cost is the same on whether you're putting it on a 1-ton mini split system, right, which would be not really doing, but a 1-ton system, or you're putting on a 100-ton system, the cost is still the same sensor, right? So don't look at some kind of like, oh, my percentage of outside air related to people versus square footage is not high. Just look at the CFM per person. That's what's going to determine your payback. And we'll talk about paybacks in a little bit here. I'm going to read one more question, then I'm going to close this poll thing because there's only one more question left right now. John says, the human body senses CO2 to determine breathing rate. If the average CO2 is higher, people will breathe more. This should increase oxygen, which would seem to be a good thing. Any research on this? John, I'll be honest with you, I've never heard of that before. I'm not saying it's true or not true. If the CO2 level is high and that's going to generate you breathing higher, it's basically because the CO2 level is high and your oxygen level is probably low. So you're starving for oxygen, which causes you to breathe more. I would not think that would be a good thing. I would think that would cause your body to work extra exertion to try to keep up, and almost maybe even go to a panic state. So off the top of my head, I would say it's probably not a good thing to have a high CO2 level. I would think lower is probably better for your body because lower CO2 probably means there's more oxygen in the air. All right, I'm going to close this poll question here. 83% of you got the correct answer, which is true. If I have DCV systems in place, I'm allowed to modulate the outdoor air ventilation code requirement below whatever the code required. So that is true. I need to catch back up on the slides here because I went back to look at one of the questions for somebody. So let's just get back real quick. Sorry about that. All right, so that was quiz question number 2. Now we're going to do quiz question number 3. Which codes have requirements for DCV? IECC 2009, IECC 2012, 2015, both 12 and 15, or all 3? Simon writes in, is DCV in a garage? What is the CO threshold? Simon, I think what you're asking is, can I do demand control ventilation in parking garages? And the answer is absolutely yes. But it is a little bit different than what we're talking about today. We don't look at CO2 sensing, which is people exhaling. You are correct that we would look at CO, carbon monoxide, because that's essentially what your cars are putting out. So you look at CO for parking garages, CO2 for people spaces. If your parking garage or your vehicle bay or whatever it is has diesel vehicles involved also, in addition to CO, you would also look at NO2, nitrogen dioxide, which would be the biggest byproduct of the diesel vehicle that we'd want to babysit. All right, you guys want to finish up answering those questions? All right, Michael keeps typing in the answers into the question chat box. Don't do that. Click on the actual answers on the screen that's being broadcast because that's what's actually going to go into the report that the people get for the PDHs. Putting them on the question box for me is not going to help them get you the right answer. I want to make sure you get them right, Mike. All right, so I'm going to close that question. The correct answer is E, all of the above. The 2009, 12, and 15 all have code requirements for demand control ventilation systems. So E was the correct answer there. All right, let's continue down our path here. So we're going to start ventilating with demand control ventilation to the actual occupancy versus the assumed / design occupancy. We're going to eliminate the wasteful overventilation. We're also going to guarantee that we got the minimum ventilation required as well, and hopefully save people money on a lot of these projects. So here's a graph that's fairly interesting, at least I think it is. Actually, it's my most favorite graph of all the presentation slides that I have. And for those of you guys that know me know that I have thousands of hours of presentations on my computer because all I do is presentations. So I love this graph for multiple reasons. I'm going to try to explain to you real quick on how it actually works. I'm even going to try to use my little John Madden deal here. All right, so on the bottom of the chart, it goes from midnight to midnight on a typical day. This is actually a building in Florida, but every single office building looks like this regardless of what city or state we look at. Up here at the top half of the drawing, that is our code required outside air that we would bring in on a regular project, right? So things go occupied at approximately 7 a.m., right? We would go up to the code required ventilation. We would stay there all day, and then at whatever, 6 p.m., we would shut it off, right? Now at nighttime, it's showing you got 30% of that code required amount. That's not really 30%. It's really whenever the system turns on, the damper opens. When it turns off, it goes back down, and you would get this up and down pattern. But on average, most of these systems run about 30% of the nighttime, right? So you got 30% ventilation activity there. That's kind of what that was trying to illustrate to you. So people come into a typical office building at 7 a.m., for example. When it goes occupied, ventilation would go on. When I start measuring the CO2 and hence the actual people in the space, what we'll notice is that most people, not most, many people don't show up for work at 7 o'clock like they were supposed to. Or the building was told to go occupied earlier than it needed to or something like that. Throughout the day, people start trickling in, and by basically 8, 9 o'clock, most of the people are at work, but not all of them, because if they were all there, we'd be up here at the code required line. And then earlier in the afternoon, or later in the morning, around 11 o'clock, people cut out for lunch. About half of them leave for lunch. Half of them stay for lunch, right? Most make it back. Some don't bother. And then, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody cuts out and goes golfing, right? That's kind of your typical office building. We call it a two-hump profile. The chance of everybody being there is pretty low. Now, if you work in an office with 2 people, okay, the chances are pretty good everyone will show up for work, right? But if you're working in a typical office building with 30, 40, 50, 200 people, whatever it is, there's no way everybody's coming to work, right? Somebody's got to go to a meeting offsite, somebody's kid is sick, somebody's got the flu, somebody's on vacation, etc. So I don't want to ventilate for the amount of design people. I want to ventilate just for the ones that actually show up. So I want to ventilate for the purple area, not the green area. Then everything between this green and purple, all this area here is going to be energy savings available to me from not running my system. So it can be quite substantial depending on the building type and your various occupancy levels. It's not just that Florida study, but there's tons of studies like that. Here's a federal one. Office buildings, once again, with that 2-hump profile, same kind of deal. Restaurants and stuff like that typically get a 3-hump profile, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And there's usually this little extra hump of like the second wave of people that come in because they don't want to come in during the busy time or whatever it is. So the point of this is that we have graphs like this for lots and lots of building types, and lots of these graphs are built into various software packages. So if you go to someone and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing DCV at a restaurant, how much energy would it save? Well, we kind of got the basic idea of your occupancy pattern at your restaurant, so we can use this profile to get a pretty good assumption on how much energy you might save, or an office or a school or whatever the profile may be. Sometimes the savings is pretty substantial. This is showing an office building and saving about 30% on average, right? So instead of ventilating this top 100% amount up on top, on average throughout the course of the year, or the course of the day, however you want to look at it, we're only going to ventilate 70, 73%, something like that. So I'm going to cut back the ventilation rate that much. Retail is the biggest drop, right? I go from, full code required ventilation down to about 10%, right? There's lots of reasons for that, right? But one of the main reasons is it's designed for the maximum occupancy day usually, which is probably, the day after Thanksgiving and for a crazy amount of people. But that's not the same amount of people that are there normally, right? Or even during the course of a regular week, the amount of people that are shopping at, 7 p.m. at Walmart on Tuesday is totally different than the amount that are shopping at 3 a.m. on Thursday. I'm sure somebody's shopping at Walmart at 3 a.m., but it's not the kind of crowd you'd see during the daytime. So that's why their ventilation rates can be cut back so much. Restaurants, same kind of deal. Restaurants are designed for whatever the busy time is. So for a lot of places, that's Saturday night dinner crowd. Well, who's there Tuesday at 9:15 in the morning, right? Hardly anybody. So they're overventilating a lot of the time. And then schools is the most interesting one, showing pretty much a 70% average reduction in the amount of ventilation required for a school. There's multiple things going on there, and everybody always guesses, oh, the summertime, yeah. And that's part of the equation, obviously. But the big thing is that you're not fully occupied at a school. So, for example, my kid's classroom, my daughter's classroom in 5th grade is designed for 30 kids. There's 30 desks in there. They only have 21 kids this year, right? So there's already 9 kids we're ventilating for that don't even exist. I'm sure nobody goes back and adjusts the outside air ventilation louver for that particular zone, right? Probably doesn't happen. So you got that problem right there. And that's assuming all 21 show up every day. I'm sure every week there's kids missing, right? Because they're sick or whatever. So there's always that happening. And the other thing is she doesn't sit in her classroom for the entire day. She's in her classroom for an hour, then she goes to a different room for arts, then a different room for her math, and then back to her main room, and then to the PE, and then to lunch, and then back to the main room, and they're moving all over the place. All the kids are doing this. So every one of those rooms is designed for the maximum occupancy, but there's whole hour blocks of time that nobody's even in that room. So cutting back the ventilation in those times when nobody's using that room can be quite a giant savings, and that's why schools are such a big one on this chart. If you look at some of these different ones around the country, there's pretty good savings on a lot of these systems. Typical places are schools, theaters, auditoriums, retail, offices. Those are the best spots. And the paybacks are typically 6 months to 2-year type range. And usually is driven by the size of the air handling system, because the control widgets cost the same for big air handler and for little air handler. So if you put it on a big air handler, it's going to save you at a faster clip, obviously, because more CFM involved. I'll skip that. There's a couple of these other studies for the interest of time. There's just tons of studies out there, and if I keep showing them all to you, you'll think you're going to save $133,000 every 6 months, but that's only if you have, an insanely large building. Most buildings are not going to be that much, obviously. These were really early adopters, people that adopted demand ventilation back in the 90s and have been doing it at their buildings for 20 plus years, which is pretty impressive. So let's talk about how it actually works, right? So there's a couple different things involved. This is the flow of a project, if you will. First, you got to decide if DCV is even appropriate for your building. It's not meant for everything, and I'll give you a chart here in a minute that shows you when it's a good idea, when it's a bad idea, and when it's a possible idea. Got to determine what you need for ventilation. So typically that's based on the code. What does the code require you to bring in for your base ventilation rate, as well as your modulation portion, the people part? What kind of control strategy do you want to use? And those choices have been limited down to pretty much doing with the PID loop, but we'll talk about different ones. And then what sensors are you going to use and where are you going to put them, right? Where you put them is fairly important. So lots of things come into play on whether it's appropriate for your application. The code required ventilation air is part of that. Pressurization is a topic too. I'm not going to go do this at an intensive care unit at a hospital, right? You probably know for doing those kind of projects, you have certain pressure zones and things like that. And if I start cutting back outside air to different zones and not touching other zones, it's probably going to mess up the pressurization, and there's going to be issues in a project like that. Same thing if I have some kind of high outside air requirement for circuit board manufacturing or something like that. I don't know. Then I might not mess around with it. But for your normal type of spaces, we can do this kind of thing. But if you're ventilating for reasons other than people, you're also not going to do it, right? So if it's some kind of chemical plant and the chemicals are my reason for having a crazy high ventilation rate, I don't want to cut back the ventilation rate because there's less guys there working today, right? Because that one guy is still going to be exposed to the same amount of chemicals, right? So it's got to be people-based occupancies that's driving the ventilation rates, and then that's when we can do this kind of thing. This chart will probably help you with that, and if you want me to send you this chart, just send me an email later, and I will email you this chart. We've been using this chart forever. By forever, I mean like 20 years. A means it's a great idea for CO2-based demand control ventilation. C means it's a horrific idea. And B means we probably should get some more details and talk about it, right? So some of the A's on here, let's see, classrooms are an A, right, for the obvious reasons I said earlier. Music rooms, libraries, those are A's. Auditoriums are great, whether they're at a school or a private one, they're fantastic. Any type of indoor sporting venue is a great one. Office buildings are great. Most retail spaces are great. We generally avoid the medical stuff because of all the pressurization stuff I was talking about before, as well as sick people. But sometimes in like the open lobby areas and stuff like that, we might do it. Hotels and conference centers, those are fantastic areas. They always have tons of people there, then less people there, then tons of people there, then less people there. So those are great. Some of these other type of indoor venues could be options. Gymnasiums are fantastic. I don't know if anybody goes to the disco anymore, but if you do, they should put CO2 sensors in there, right? That'd be the equivalent of today's dance club or whatever. Bowling alleys, now that they're smoke-free, that's a good one. Movie theaters are one of the absolute best, right? So some of these are fantastic candidates. You should think about doing it in those types of projects. Ones that are really bad are the C's, right? A guard station at a prison. Hopefully all the guards are showing up to work, right? Otherwise we have bigger issues. So the ventilation rate shouldn't really change. Anything with chemicals going on. So dry cleaners, no, right? Stay away from dry cleaners. Some of the manufacturing stuff, no for chemical reasons. Paint booths, no for chemical reasons. Swimming pools, no for chlorine chemical reasons, right? Autopsy rooms, first of all, everybody in there is dead, so they shouldn't really be breathing. And the one guy that is breathing and working is probably more concerned about the chemicals. So we're going to stay away from those kind of places that are chemical driven. So they have high ventilation rates because of chemicals, not because of the two people working there. Other ones that are bad, locker rooms and pet shops. They stink. They always stink, right? If you've ever been to your kid's hockey practice or whatever, the locker room smells like crap on day one. Do not start cutting the ventilation rate back there. Same with pet shops, pet stores, boarding centers for animals. Anywhere with animal care, probably not going to be a great one. Kitchens are an issue. Kitchens, you can do demand control ventilation, but it's going to be based on the stove cook operation, not based on the people, right? Because that's what's driving the ventilation in that building. So we'll talk about that in a little while here. Anything with vehicles is bad. You can do demand control ventilation in there, but it's not going to be CO2 ventilation. It's going to be CO and NO2 for vehicles. So that's why it's bad on this particular chart. Other bad ones, shipping and warehouse areas. Those buildings are so huge, and there's like 3 guys working there. You could be in there breathing all day, and I'm never going to sense you breathing. So the volume of space is just too big. Like I said, most of the medical stuff we'll stay away from. B's are the maybes, and those are the ones usually that require some type of conversation specifically, right? So typical things that you need to think about on B's. Dining halls and dining rooms and cafeterias, those places are maybes because a lot of times, unfortunately, the dining room ventilation makeup air is used to make up air for the kitchen hood, exhaust hood. And if you do that, you can't start cutting back the ventilation rate. Now, if the dining room and the kitchen are, in fact, pressure separated and they have their own exhaust and supply systems for outdoor, then you could totally do it. That's why it would become a yes. Some of the places that involve smoking, like smoking lounges and bars and casinos, right? Those are maybes because we had to ask you if you smoked or not. Now that you can't smoke anywhere, these all become A's if we read this chart again today. Other maybes would be things like, well, you got the shop. Well, what are you doing in the shop, right? I got manufacturing. Well, what are you doing in the manufacturing? You got to tell me what you got going on. Other places that are maybes, hardware stores, furniture stores, clothing, and florists, and beauty salon type places. They typically have chemicals going on, so they're probably going to be a no. Even your typical, say, furniture store, you bring in new furniture every couple of weeks with new VOCs that's off-gassing, and all the off-gassing happens when things are brand new, right? That's the new car smell. So I really got to let that stuff dilute down. So a lot of those places become maybes because of that stuff going on. So that's just stuff to think about. So hopefully you find that chart to be useful and help you evaluate whether a project is good or not. So schools, retail, offices, those are the big ones. The ventilation requirement, you need to know what your design ventilation requirement is by code as if you did not have DCV, and all of your systems, heating and cooling coils need to be designed to handle that. Because at some point in time, it's going to have to do full ventilation, right? The full design ventilation. And then we'll be throttling back lower than that the rest of the time. Then you got to figure out your base ventilation rate. That used to be a lot harder, and I used to randomly pick 30% with no real science behind that, and it was a pretty conservative number. These guys on this chart are even showing 20%. The problem with random is code guys don't like me randomly picking a number. So once the standards and codes change to separate the per person and the per square foot number, then all of a sudden magically we had the number. The base ventilation rate, meaning how far am I allowed to throttle this back to, is the larger of what is the per square foot required by code, that portion of the code requirement, or what do I need for makeup air purposes to make up for exhaust fans and things like that to keep my building slightly positive, right? So 100% on this chart is whatever my code required. My lower number, 20, 30%, something like that, is based on what's the absolute minimum I can throttle back to. And I'm going to modulate between that 120 on this chart all day long, depending on what's actually going on in the space. I'm going to skip along a little bit here in the interest of time and get us to quiz question number 4. Which of the below might be the best application for CO2-based demand control ventilation? A, commercial kitchen, B, school, C, condo building, D, warehouse. If you had to pick one of these to be the best case to put CO2-based demand control ventilation in, which one would you pick if you could only pick one? And let's see if we got any new questions. Philip writes, how do you account for natural ventilation due to air infiltration or windows, doors that open to the outdoor? If there's natural ventilation, can we reduce the minimum ventilation rate correspondingly, DCV aside? So a couple things. One, I hate natural ventilation. I'll just say that up front. A lot of you guys probably hate it as well. I don't know how much fresh air you're getting. And more importantly, most people don't open the window at the correct time. They open the window when it's nice out, and when it's really hot and really cold, they shut the window, right? So if I'm relying on natural ventilation and you're not opening the window every single day, it doesn't really do anything, right? So I don't like it for that reason. But unrelated to that, if I have CO2-based systems and you open the window, you're going to get a credit for that natural ventilation because the CO2 level outside is lower than inside. And as that air leaks in, it's going to dilute down your CO2, which means that your system, your makeup air system, your economizer, outside air loop, or whatever you have, it's going to say, oh, CO2 level is a little bit lower. I guess I can throttle that back. So as you open more windows in a naturally ventilated space that has CO2 sensors, those spaces will get less air through the mechanical system and save you some energy there. All right, so it does kind of help you in that regard. All right, I'm going to close this poll question, and 98% of you got it correct, which is school. They have large amounts of people coming and going, so they're excellent candidates. Kitchens are bad because the ventilation there is not dictated by people. It's dictated by the makeup required for the exhaust system. Condos are bad because there's hardly anybody there, right? There's 1 or 2 people per condo unit, so it's not really enough to get a good sensing population. And warehouses are bad, same kind of idea. The volume is so large relative to the number of people. So I need lots of people. I need them to be moving around, coming and going for DCV to make a lot of sense. So 98% of the people got that correct. All right, let's continue on with our last little segment here. I hinted at set points before, and I told you that City of Chicago, it's 1,000 parts per million fixed number. Everywhere else that's following ASHRAE 62 or IMC is typically going to be a delta above the outdoor air level. For example, for an office, I'm going to use 700 parts per million above the outdoor air. So if it's 400 or 450, let's say it's 450 outside, it gives me an 1150 set point for my DCV sensor. So 1150 puts me like right around here, right at the very edge of that ideal range, which on the old ventilation scale would have probably equated to about, we'll say, 13 CFM per person, right, total of square footage and people combined on this particular scale. So the higher or lower my levels are, that changes my set point indoors. And the reason that is because we don't really care what the CO2 is in the space. Once again, it's not a pollutant. All I really want to do is backwards calculate how much ventilation air am I bringing in. So it's a function of what is the CO2 outside and inside for me to do that mass balance equation and figure that out. Now, I don't have to actually figure that out. I can just do a PID loop and throttle it more or less. But that's essentially what's happening. Additionally, if you look at all the ASHRAE 62 standard history from, back in the 80s and beyond, earlier even, the original ventilation rates that were developed actually come out of CO2 study data, right? So CO2 levels for determining how much balance I have between outside and inside has always been there. It just was never explicitly called out until 2004, right? So for offices and schools and stuff like that, keep a check figure in your head of 700 parts per million above the outdoor air level, or you could be conservative and just tell all your products, you know what, I'm going to go with 1,000, just like the City of Chicago, and that's going to be a super safe level to go to. Control strategies, you're pretty much going to do a PID loop. You could have done it with a relay control like we're doing here, like we used to do back in the 90s, which meant I waited till my CO2 level got to some maximum threshold. Then I freaked out, and the CO2 sensor sent an alarm to the outside air controller and said, oh my gosh, we're at this maximum amount. We're at 1,200 parts per million. You better do something. And then the damper would just go wide open, or not wide open. It would go back up to the design ventilation rate. And then once the level got back down, it would go down to the base. So it would either be open, closed, open, closed, open, closed. No real modulation. There's no reason to do that anymore. Like I said, every single economizer controller has a modulating input waiting for it, and the CO2 sensor costs actually less if you get one with modulating versus asking for one with a relay. So this has essentially been eliminated. There's no reason to do that. Nowadays, you're going to use a PI control, proportional integral, or proportional integral derivative, PID loop. I'm sure you've all heard of a PID loop. The thing with PID loops is that oftentimes we never even bother putting in the differential term. It's just with a giant louver or a giant chill water valve or whatever I'm controlling in the HVAC world, to put in the D gain, the benefit is so minimal. So we'll call it a PID loop, but sometimes we'll just tune it as if it was a PI loop. But anyway, the way that would work is I wouldn't just go more open, close, open, close. I would modulate smoothly, right? So I would go from whatever. Let's say my minimum is 6% on the damper actuator, and my maximum is 20%. I wouldn't just go 6%, then 20, then 6, then 20. I would go 6, 7, 8, 6, 9, 12, 8, 9. I would bounce back and forth like that, 20, right? It would keep throttling smoothly in between there, which is going to help me not overshoot as easily. It's just a smoother way to do it, and it's super easy to control, and it's built into everybody's economizer controller and DDC controller as a standard thing. So I'm just going to modulate up and down this curve instead of slamming it open and slamming it closed. PID loop does the same kind of thing, right? I get that proportional integral control, plus I tack on the differential term, which helps me fine tune it in. PID loop discussion is like a whole nother topic in and of itself, unrelated to DCV, just in general. We could talk about that for a whole hour. Location of CO2 sensors. For starters, do not put them in the return duct. In almost no scenario is that a good idea. The problem with return ducts is many. First of all, if you have a zoning system like VAV, a lot of people want to put one in the return duct and say, oh, I just could buy one instead of buying 12, right? One for every damper. The problem with that is you're sensing the average. The problem with the average is it has nothing to do with what's going on in your zones. So let's say I have a space that has 12 VAV boxes, 11 offices, and a conference room, and 11 people work there. We're all in our offices. There's a certain amount of breathing we're doing. The CO2 is going up in the return duct. It's measuring it. Everything's normal. We all leave our office and we all pile into the conference room, right? The amount of CO2 at the sensor in the return duct is going to be identical as it was a few minutes ago. The problem is I'm still ventilating all these offices and I'm not ventilating that room because the sensor still thinks it's the same scenario. You cannot put it in the return duct for zone systems at all whatsoever. You need to put it in the actual space. The other major issue is ductwork is horrifically leaky. If you make ductwork for a living, I apologize, but it's really bad. Maybe not your job, but everybody else's job is bad. So I'm sucking air in from all kinds of cracks and crevices that it shouldn't be coming from, and I really don't care about that air. If I want to measure the CO2 level of the people, I need to measure where the people are. So you need to put the CO2 sensor in the space on the wall next to or as part of the actual thermostat. It should be in the breathing zone, 4 to 6 feet above the floor, just like you put the thermostats and light switches and all that stuff. Some standards, like the LEED standard, require it to be that way. You're not allowed to put it in the return duct. Some utility programs are the same way. Focus on Energy in Wisconsin, for the first 2 weeks had it written in the return duct, and they realized they wrote it backwards. And now correctly for the past several years says you cannot put it in the return duct. You have to mount it on the wall. A CO2 sensor can handle about 5,000 square feet, but that's 5,000 square feet single zone. If you have two unrelated zones, let's say you have a hotel conference center and they have the dividers that come down the room and divide it into 3 rooms, you need 3 CO2 sensors. Because if we're using the middle room for our party and your sensor's over there in the left room, that sensor's not measuring any people. So I'm not changing the ventilation rate. So every zone, and however you want to define a zone is another discussion, but every unique zone needs to have its own sensor, right? And 5,000 square feet is about the max per zone, and then you need multiple sensors for that zone. Try to avoid putting it by windows and doors, just like we don't put thermostats there. Thermostats is for the solar, reasons and maybe a little infiltration. For the CO2, it's all because of the infiltration. I don't want to pick it up at the window. I want to pick it up after it's fully mixed throughout the room. So 1 sensor per zone, 5,000 square feet maximum per sensor. Mount them on the wall, not the return duct. If you have VAV systems, you need 1 per damper. Or if you don't want to do that, you can use in ASHRAE, we have this equation 6.1. You can use that dynamically to look for the critical space zones and only put sensors in those zones, and then use that equation dynamically and calculate it continuously to do it that way. Only one control manufacturer I'm aware of does it that way. Everybody else just puts 1 sensor in per zone because it's a safer, easier bet. Like I said, it's easy to put it in economizers. Most economizer controllers have it. As you probably know, Honeywell only makes 1 economizer controller. They stopped manufacturing all the others. The Jade controller, W7220 on the left-hand side picture here, is the only thing they make, and it can handle CO2 sensors. The older ones you'll find in the field, the 7212 series there, 7200 series, those ones have a CO2 sensor waiting for them as well. So unless you have something really old, like over here on the right-hand side, that's from the 80s, unless you have that, you could probably retrofit it pretty easy on your existing control system. All right, last thing, I'm going to skip ahead just to get you guys on time here. It's not new. Like I said before, this is old stuff, right? This is literally, this year, it is 100-year-old concept using CO2 to dictate ventilation rates. It's just that before, we can use it for engineering calculations and writing codes and stuff like that. We couldn't do it dynamically. Digital controls, the advent of digital controls in the 1980s is what made this possible to do it on the fly instead of doing it, once as some dude's writing the handbook or the code book. All right, so it's a 100-year-old concept that really went into play in the 80s and 90s. The reason it's more popular now, codes require it, obviously. DDC controls made it a lot easier. Energy costs don't usually go down, right? But the sensor cost has come down. Well, it was coming down. Now it's kind of flattened out, but it's definitely not what it used to be. When I started, it used to be pretty expensive. It cost you to buy a sensor. It cost you $700-800. Now you can get sensors for $200-300. So it's pretty cost effective to buy these sensors now. To Mike's point earlier, sensor calibration is a topic. When I first started putting it in, they had a 1-year calibration guarantee, and I had to go back and calibrate sensors. And the first time you go back to a VAV job and recalibrate 80 sensors, you're like, oh my gosh, that's horrible, that's stupid. I don't want to do that ever again. So what some of the sensor manufacturers have done is they've designed for calibration free. Right, and there's some debate there on how free that is. I mean, I would still check them. I'd spot check them every few years, but in general, they're designing these things for a 15-year lifespan and giving you a 10-year calibration guarantee. When I was still doing field controls in the early 2000s, I would probably installed, I don't even know, 700-800 of these sensors, and I only had to take like 3 or 4 of them back to the manufacturer because of that calibration guarantee. I'll explain how that works here in a minute. Most of the CO2 sensor manufacturers on the market have the same, what I call the CO2 engine, the sensor and the circuit board here that we're showing on top. They come from like 2 places, right? It's kind of like buying a GMC car. You can call it GMC, you can call it Chevy, you can call it Buick, you can call it Pontiac. Everybody knows it's GMC. Same kind of thing here. There's only 2 places to really get these engines, regardless of whose plastic enclosure you stuck them in. The reason that they are quote-unquote calibration free is because of these control routines they have. This particular manufacturer calls it automatic baseline calibration, ABC logic. The other manufacturer has some other name for it, but it's the same basic thing. The idea here is if your building goes unoccupied for at least 4 hours a week, we can do this. For a normal building, it takes about 4 hours for you to have enough infiltration, exfiltration in the building for whatever's going on inside the building to become the same as outside. So if your level outside is 470 parts per million and you leave the building all night and no one's there, eventually the inside levels will also be 470 parts per million. And the outside CO2 levels, unless you're buying a manufacturing plant that's weird, the outside CO2 levels do not change on a day-to-day basis. They change on a decade-by-decade basis, but not a day-to-day basis. So basically what these sensors do is they recalibrate themselves every night back to the original baseline. They just keep tweaking themselves. And if you have one night where you pull an all-nighter, no big deal. It'll eventually correct itself in the next day or 2. There's 3 sensors over the course of, what is that, a week, right, side by side, and they basically calibrated themselves to be essentially equivalent. There's 3 sensors over the course of 2 weeks, being essentially equivalent every day, right? There's 3 sensors over the course of 3 years being essentially equivalent. I'm saying essentially equivalent because they're probably all 50 parts per million different than each other, right? But if you look at the specs of the CO2 sensor manufacturer, most of them have an accuracy that's kind of in that range anyway, right? The point is they're not going to drift hundreds and hundreds of parts per million out of calibration. They're going to keep tweaking themselves and be relatively close. So the goal is to ventilate for actual versus assumed occupancy. Don't pay money to overventilate. Make sure you are complying with the codes by not underventilating any of these spaces, and make sure you're complying with the codes that are required for energy code, and hopefully save some people in the meantime. And that brings us to our last quiz question, and then I'll show you a couple things if you want to stay on line. Our last question, true or false? All CO2 sensors need annual calibration. So I know some do, and Mike mentioned some do, but do they all need it? Based on the last couple slides, what do you think? I don't see any other questions typed in at the moment. So after we answer this, anybody who wants to stick on for an extra 3-4 minutes and see a few more details on rebates in the area, beyond the NICOR ones, as well as seeing some quick energy calcs, I will stay on for 3 or 4 minutes and do that with you. As far as our poll question is concerned, though, 89% of you voted, so I'm going to close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And those of you that answered false are correct. In general, these sensors should not need annual calibration. All right. As far as paybacks go, there's tons of software packages you can use. I use this one quite a bit. This is a free package from Honeywell. I don't work for Honeywell. I just like free stuff, and I like stuff that takes 5 minutes. I'm not going to go through the whole software with you. This is kind of the final screen of it. But you basically go and you tell it what tonnage equipment you have, what climate zone you're in, what your utility rates are. You pull them from a drop-down box. What your occupancy is. You could put it in manually if you know it, or you can just pick school, retail from one of the drop-downs, and they already have, the 2-hump curves and all that kind of stuff. And then when you hit submit, this software package will tell you how much money you can save by putting in programmable thermostat. So base case to programmable thermostat, in this case $1,700. What if I put an economizer in, $1,800, enthalpy economizer, and so on. DCV, $1,862 in savings, and then DCV combined with the economizer functions, right? So $1,800, this is a 10-ton unit in the city of Chicago. If the sensor costs me $200 or $300, and let's say I mark it up, I double it to install it, and it takes me 4 hours at $100 an hour to install it, that's still $250, $500, $900. So with $1,800 savings, that's a 6-month payback. By the way, it says payback of 0 years here because I didn't put any costs in for the equipment. But payback of 6 months for this particular project, which was an office building on 10 tons. So it would be pretty beneficial. And you can use this tool. It's free. You can download it. It's no big deal. If you have zone damper systems, that tool will not work. Zone damper systems are much different for DCV. There is this software package. It says Carrier on there. There's actually, the current one is made by Telair. It's the same thing. Ventilator is the name of the software. And you can do the same kind of quick analysis on a zoning system. It won't be 5 minutes. It'll be a 15-minute analysis, but you can do it. You could also do it in the energy modeling programs like HAP and Trace and DOE and all those kind of things too. But this is just a quick tool for just DCV, and you're basically ignoring the rest of your building and deciding, should I even talk about CO2 sensors with somebody? As I mentioned at the beginning, the Energy Smart program from NICOR Gas has a $150 rebate for installing CO2 sensors at commercial properties. You'll see on there that they have to have that manufacturer guarantee for 10 years because they don't want you going back and calibrating this stuff either. But other than that, it's not a very hard rebate to get. So you get $150 per sensor. Additionally, if you are in NICOR territory, you are very probably in the ComEd territory on your electric, you can get a rebate on the electric side, which in that case is paid a little differently. Instead of $150 per sensor, it's 4 cents per square foot of controlled area. So you get both the NICOR and the ComEd rebate, and you would double dip them. ComEd also has the Air Care Plus program where you can get it there based on rooftops. That's kind of a niche program, only open to certain contractors though. But the 4 cents per square foot is available to everybody. If you're doing a public building, you do not get your rebates at all for any topic from ComEd or NICOR. You get them from DCEO. And that rebate program is once again funded. It was off last year, but it's back on this year as of July. And that rebate is pretty substantial. It's 14 cents per square foot on the gas side plus 6 cents on the electric side. So 20 cents per square foot you can get for putting DCV in a public building, meaning village hall, fire station, public school, police station, those sorts of things. Federal building, right? That kind of deal. Other ones in the Midwest area, Wisconsin has a very good program for rooftop optimization, similar to what we have here for ComEd with the Air Care Plus, except the Wisconsin one is open to all contractors, and it's $350 per rooftop on that rebate. Or if you do a built-up air handler system, it's $20 per outside air CFM. So a little bit different way of doing it. NIPSCO gas in Indiana is 11.5 cents per square foot. Michigan is 5 cents per square foot on the gas side. So there are some rebates out there for you guys that are in this Midwestern area. I mentioned that there are other applications for DCV that have nothing to do with CO2 sensors. Those two applications are kitchens and vehicles. So some of the gas utilities in the area have rebates for kitchens. So you can see there, Peoples Gas, North Shore Gas, Focus on Energy, NIPSCO. They'll pay you in most cases per exhaust fan horsepower. The smaller the exhaust fan or the more you reduce it, the less ventilation air you need to make it up, and hence the less gas heating you need to run. And then parking garages, it's based on per exhaust fan horsepower, same reason. If I sense high levels of CO or NO2 in a diesel area, then I will modulate the exhaust fan higher, and when less vehicles are there and running, I will modulate it below the code required minimum to save energy. So those rebate programs are out there. And then there are other ways you can do it. It doesn't have to be a CO2 sensor to determine occupancy in a space. You need a CO2 sensor if you want to modulate the occupancy. But if you just want to turn the ventilation on and off, you could do it by lots of other means. For example, in a hotel room, I could have a motion sensor, or I can have one of those key card slots. And if your key card is not in the slot, guess what? You don't get full HVAC operation, and you don't get any ventilation air, right? I can have the key fob swipers at your office building. When you swipe out for the day with your key fob and leave the building, well, if you have your own VAV box at your office, let's go ahead and relax your set points, and let's cut back your ventilation to nothing because you're not there, right? So there's ways you can do this. Most times it can be done with a CO2 sensor. The only time it's really popular to do it without a CO2 sensor seems to be school classrooms, because a lot of times it's all or nothing in those cases. And sometimes they'll do it with a motion sensor, not because the motion sensor is so much more cheap than the CO2 sensor, but because they want the motion sensor for the HVAC set points and the lighting, and they can do it all off of one sensor. So you can kill 3 birds with 1 stone. So a lot of times they'll do a classroom with a motion sensor or thermal sensor. Any other final questions? John says CO2 is higher in the winter and lower in the summer. How is this factored into the auto baseline? I'm assuming you're talking about outdoor air levels, John, and give me some help. Tell me how much higher and how much lower, because I'm not aware of that particular fluctuation in the outdoor air levels. But if we're talking about something that's going to be 10, 20, 30 parts per million higher or lower, that's basically irrelevant because it's not even within the accuracy of the sensor. If you're talking about something that's going to be 100 parts per million, I would question whether that would be accurate or not. I can't imagine that the CO2 level has been that much different. I take CO2 level readings outside quite a bit, or at least I did when I was in the field and setting these systems up to figure out what my baseline needed to be so I could figure out my set point. And city of Chicago would usually be around 500. Suburbs would be like 425, 450. And I didn't really see any fluctuation based on outdoor air temperature. So I'm guessing the levels you're talking about are pretty minor in the grand scheme of things and not more than 40 or 50 parts per million. Anybody other questions to type in? Oh, John typed another question in after he typed that first one in, saying he realized it wasn't auto baseline we were talking about, so he rescinded his question. But nonetheless, it was an interesting one to think about. Because I see his point being that, oh, if you're going to do it every night, you're going to keep tweaking it every night. Any fluctuation in outdoor air level, whether it's 5 or 50 parts per million outside, it's going to get factored in because you're doing it every single night. And the CO2 is not going to be dramatic from day to day. John also mentions he thinks it's about 10% drift on CO2 level. So if that was the case and it's 450 outside, maybe you float between 400 and 500 or something like that over the course of a year, which would be, for this purpose, would be not critical. All right, I think everybody's questions are answered. If you have other questions, you can call me or email me later. Most of the time I'd say email them to me unless it's an emergency. I can't imagine you have an emergency for ventilation, but if you did, that'd be fine. But usually I'm teaching classes during the day, so you're probably going to send me an email and then get a reply back at night. Is pretty common for me. But other than that, I thank you guys for your time, and we'll see you at the next set of webinars. I think there's one on IAQ next week, and then the week after that, there's controls codes for commercial buildings. So we'll see you then. Thanks.